June 4, 1942, Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll, 10:24 a.m. Lieutenant Commander W.D.E. McCluskey peered down from 14,000 feet and witnessed something thought impossible. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, arranged in a flawless diamond formation. Their decks were crowded with armed planes, fuel lines stretched across the wooden surfaces, and ordnance carts positioned beside ready bombers. Every aircraft was prepped for launch. At that moment, the carriers were in their most exposed state. McCluskey had spent the previous 2 hours scanning the empty ocean, fuel running dangerously low, with 32 dive bombers tailing him toward what seemed like a doomed mission. Japanese ships were nowhere near the location predicted by American intelligence. Units from USS Enterprise and Hornet had become scattered, and Torpedo Squadron 8 had already been wiped out, every plane lost except one. The American offensive was crumbling. Yet, half an hour earlier, McCluskey had made a choice that would alter the Pacific War's trajectory. Reaching the expected rendezvous point only to find open water, he did not retreat. Instead, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing northeast after depth-charging the submarine Nautilus. Trusting his instincts, he followed its wake. Now, as he began his steep dive, McCluskey was about to strike a blow that would dismantle Japanese naval dominance in just 5 minutes. The Japanese were unaware of the dive bombers above them, lacking radar and having no fighters in the sky. Perception of itself in early 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire saw itself as unstoppable. In that period, it had seized territory larger than Europe, capturing Hong Kong in 18 days, Manila in 26, and Singapore in 70. British forces were driven from Malaya, the Dutch from Indonesia, and Americans from the Philippines. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, remained undefeated, having destroyed 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, Australia, and forced the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean, sinking the carrier Hermes and 2 cruisers. Japanese pilots were among the most seasoned in the world, with combat experience in China since 1937. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters outclassed all Allied counterparts, and their torpedo and dive bombers had proven devastating. Japan's naval philosophy emphasized aggressive initiative, the supremacy of offensive action, and the belief that the fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi, could overcome material shortcomings. Commanders saw their men as superior in skill, devotion, and willingness to die for the emperor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated the Midway operation to complete the conquest Pearl Harbor had begun. The plan aimed to draw American attention north with a diversionary strike on the Aleutians, then attack Midway with the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled, forcing U.S. carriers into battle and crushing them with overwhelming strength. Yamamoto's force included over 200 ships, 4 fleet carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, with 248 aircraft, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, and 15 submarines. The one advantage the Americans held was knowledge. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had cracked Japanese codes, revealing the date, target, and composition of the approaching fleet. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, concealed and ready. Yet, knowing the enemy's plan did not ensure success. American strikes that morning had already faltered. Midway's marine fighters were annihilated by Zeros. High-altitude B-17 bombers missed. Marine dive bombers were shot down before reaching their targets. Torpedo attacks were executed without coordination or fighter cover. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 planes, leaving only Ensign George Gay afloat in the Pacific, witnessing the destruction. Across all three carriers, 41 torpedo bombers attacked, and only 6 returned. None scored a hit. The mission seemed nearly suicidal as Japanese fighters tore through the slow TBD devastators with their 20mm cannons. Anti-aircraft fire erupted across the sky, sending dark plumes into the air. American torpedoes, plagued by mechanical failures, either ran beneath their targets or failed to detonate. On the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuida observed the assaults with a mixture of disdain and admiration. Fuida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and directed the airstrikes that devastated Battleship Row, was well versed in naval aviation. He recognized the bravery of the American torpedo crews, yet their efforts were futile. No Japanese carrier had been hit, and the planes and crews were being lost in vain. Finally located by Japanese reconnaissance, the carriers were poised to unleash their full offensive. On Akagi, 36 aircraft were prepared on the flight deck, engines running, armed and fueled for a decisive strike. Kaga held 30 planes, while Soryu had 21. Together, the counterattack force numbered 87 aircraft, theoretically enough to destroy the American carrier group. Confident after repelling the torpedo attacks and shooting down dozens of American planes, Nagumo anticipated a swift victory. As the carriers turned into the wind for launch, the Japanese pilots remained unaware of the looming danger. At 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander McCloskey's dive bombers initiated their assault. 32 Douglas SBD Dauntless planes dove from 14,000 feet at steep angles and high speed. Japanese anti-aircraft guns, optimized for low-level attacks, could not respond fast enough, and the Zero fighters remained too far below to intercept. The carriers committed to launch operations were virtually immobile, presenting ideal targets. The bombs, 500-pound armor-piercing with delayed fuses, penetrated the flight decks before detonating. Within 4 seconds of release, the first bomb struck Kaga, igniting fuel and ordnance. Subsequent hits tore through the deck and superstructure, including the bridge, killing Captain Jaku Okada and senior staff. In less than a minute, Kaga was transformed from a formidable warship into a conflagration. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Richard Best's section had initially targeted Kaga, but adjusted mid-dive to strike Akagi. Within minutes, Soryu was engulfed in fire, and her crew abandoned ship. In just 5 minutes, the 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were mortally damaged. More than 200 aircraft were lost, either destroyed on deck or trapped in the hangars below, and over 700 trained pilots and aircrew were killed or doomed. These carriers represented 2/3 of Japan's fleet carrier strength, all of which had participated in major operations since Pearl Harbor. Akagi displaced 36,000 tons and carried 91 aircraft. Kaga, 38,000 tons with 90 planes. And Soryu, the smallest, was nonetheless a critical component of Japan's carrier force. The sudden, precise dive bomber strikes had irrevocably shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific, demonstrating the deadly efficiency of coordinated carrier-based air attacks. The Japanese carrier Soryu, displacing 18,000 tons and carrying a complement of 71 aircraft, had been central to Japan's naval air capabilities. In the span of just 5 minutes, pilots and crew with years of combat experience, some dating back to the 1937 conflict in China, were lost. These were highly trained men whose expertise in torpedo runs, dive bombing, and air-to-air combat could not be replaced. Torpedo bomber crews were capable of striking within mere feet of a target. Dive bomber pilots could hit moving ships from altitudes of 12,000 feet. And fighter pilots had already amassed victories over Allied aircraft in campaigns from China to Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies. Planes, effectively turning the carriers into massive explosives. Admiral Nagumo on Akagi attempted to maintain command amid the chaos, but smoke and fire made the bridge untenable. By 10:46 a.m., he was forced to descend a rope to escape the flames, transferring command to the light cruiser Nagara. Below decks, crews fought desperately to contain fires, but aviation fuel and munitions detonated, sending the hangar into an inferno. Many sailors trapped inside perished or jumped into the sea. Despite efforts from officers like Captain Tairo Aoki, containment was impossible. Ultimately, 267 men died aboard Akagi. Kaga experienced a similar fate. Multiple bomb hits triggered uncontrollable fires, overwhelming the ship's damage control systems, which were designed only for single impacts. Flooding, power loss, and broken communications left firefighters without coordination or resources. By afternoon, the order to abandon ship was given, resulting in 81 deaths. Soryu sank the fastest. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave, choosing to go down with his vessel. Fires spread quickly through the thinner hull, and the carrier capsized at 7:13 p.m. on June 4, taking 71 crewmen and her captain with her. Only one carrier, Hiru, survived the initial attack, having been positioned several miles north of the others. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi immediately organized a counterstrike, launching dive bombers and torpedo planes that severely damaged Yorktown, forcing her crew to abandon ship by mid-afternoon. However, U.S. forces retaliated swiftly. Aircraft from Enterprise located Hiru and bombed her, igniting fires across the hangar deck. The losses were staggering. In a single day, Japan's naval aviation lost all 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, along with 248 aircraft and roughly 3,000 personnel, including many of its most experienced pilots and aircrew. The force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was effectively destroyed, leaving a profound psychological impact. Japanese Naval Command, accustomed to rapid victories and confident in its training and experience, confronted the unprecedented reality of catastrophic defeat. In a single morning, the backbone of Japan's carrier fleet was shattered by an American force that was smaller in both ships and aircraft. Commander Fluida, recovering from injuries aboard the destroyer that had rescued him from the Kagi, immediately recognized the magnitude of the disaster. Japan had lost not just a battle, but the war itself. The naval air dominance that had enabled Japan's rapid expansion had vanished. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable due to the lengthy training required, were dead. The carriers, products of years of labor, now rested at the bottom of the Pacific. American losses, by comparison, were minimal. The Yorktown, already damaged before the battle, was the only carrier sunk, while the destroyer Hammond was lost to a Japanese submarine during salvage operations. American aircraft losses totaled 147 planes, with 307 personnel lost. The ratio of losses was catastrophic for Japan: 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, and roughly 3,000 men for every single American carrier, 147 planes, and 307 personnel. Shortages and industrial capacity could build perhaps 1 carrier per year at best. Japan entered the war with 6 fleet and 4 light carriers. After Midway, 4 fleet carriers were gone, while the remaining 2 had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Shikaku and Zuikaku would not return to service for months. The carrier fleet was crippled, and the loss of experienced pilots was even more damaging. Producing a single combat-ready carrier pilot required years of rigorous training, with a high failure rate. Japan began with approximately 1,500 skilled pilots. After Midway, maybe 1,000 remained. The training system could not supply replacements fast enough. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups were filled with minimally trained pilots flying outdated planes against highly experienced American aviators. Admiral Yamamoto, observing from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the news in disbelief. The Midway operation, planned to annihilate the American carriers, had ended in the destruction of Japan's own carrier strength. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, he ordered a withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was aborted, and the fleet returned in humiliation. Battleships intended to bombard the island never fired, submarines failed to intercept American forces, and diversionary attacks achieved nothing beyond temporarily occupying islands Japan would later abandon. The retreating Japanese fleet was pursued. On June 6th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, which had collided during the chaotic withdrawal. Mikuma sank after repeated bombing, while Mogami was severely damaged and spent a year under repair. 2 months later, U.S. forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a 6-month campaign that further weakened Japanese air power. Shikaku and Zuikaku participated, but suffered heavy losses, and by mid-1943, Japanese carrier air groups were shadows of their former selves. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier forces suffered catastrophic losses in what American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day, flown by pilots with minimal training or combat experience. By October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese carriers were little more than decoys, carrying few planes and no skilled pilots. They drew American forces north while battleships attempted to attack the invasion beaches, but the decoy carriers were eventually sunk without impacting the outcome. From Midway onward, the path to Japan's defeat was clear. Without control of the air, Japan could not defend its conquests. Without the territories, vital resources like oil were inaccessible, crippling industrial production. Without production, the military could not replace losses. The decline was irreversible, setting Japan on an unbroken course toward defeat. The choice made by Lieutenant Commander McCluskey to press on with the search despite dwindling fuel, tracking the wake of the destroyer Arashi, allowed him to strike at the exact moment when the Japanese carriers were at their most exposed. Admiral Nimitz would later assert that McCluskey's decision determined the outcome of both the carrier task force and the broader engagement at Midway. Had that moment not occurred, had those 5 critical minutes at 10:24 a.m. was removed from his post and reassigned to a remote position, He would take his own life in July 1944 during the fight for Saipan rather than be captured. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who went down with the Hiyu, had been regarded as one of the Navy's brightest strategists, and his death eliminated a leader who might have mitigated the disasters that followed. For American aviators, the triumph came at a severe cost. Torpedo Squadron 8 was completely wiped out, with only Ensign George Gay surviving from 15 crews. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 planes, while Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 suffered 10 losses out of 12. Dive bomber units also incurred casualties. Overall, 54 of the 115 American aircraft that attacked the Japanese carriers that day were lost. Despite the heavy toll, the surviving pilots understood they had achieved something remarkable. McCluskey himself, wounded in the shoulder during his return, reached the Enterprise with under 5 gallons of fuel, while some aviators ran out and had to ditch at sea. 10 men from McCluskey's group never returned. The victory hinged on a narrow and extraordinary alignment of circumstances. McCluskey's keen judgment, the torpedo crews drawing enemy fighters downward, the work of cryptographers deciphering Japanese codes, and Nimitz's strategic positioning of carriers northeast of Midway all combined to create a fleeting opportunity. The Japanese carriers were turning into the wind for launch just as American forces arrived, and the enemy combat air patrol was drawn low in pursuit of torpedo bombers. What appeared as luck was reinforced by deliberate, courageous decisions. The United States would assume control, and Japan would be forced into defensive operations, losing island after island until the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 compelled surrender. The consequences of those 5 minutes extended far beyond Midway. By July 1945, Japan lacked the carriers, naval superiority, and resources necessary to repel an American invasion of the home islands. The kamikaze attacks of 1945 were a symptom of this collapse. Poorly trained pilots, replacing the lost veterans, could only attempt suicidal strikes against U.S. ships. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the Midway operation, never regained his former momentum. His health deteriorated, and his outlook grew increasingly fatalistic. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted details of his inspection tour of forward bases. Acting on this intelligence, Nimitz ordered a targeted strike, and P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville, removing the strategist behind both Pearl Harbor and Midway. The events of that single 5-minute window on June 4, 1942, underscored a central principle of modern warfare. Timely decisions, intelligence, and courage can alter the course of entire conflicts. In warfare, material resources often outweigh morale, and intelligence frequently proves more decisive than careful operational planning. Victory favors the side that can replenish its losses quickly, anticipate the opponent's moves, and maintain coordination across multiple units, even when events go awry. Japanese defensive fighters down to sea level, enabling dive bombers to find their mark. The American system succeeded despite individual failures, while the Japanese system, despite exceptional skill and resolve, lacked adaptability. Once fires erupted, carriers were damaged, and leadership was forced to abandon flagship vessels. Their command structure collapsed. There was no redundancy, no depth of resilience. Vulnerabilities in carrier design compounded the problem. Fuel lines were exposed on flight decks, bombs and torpedoes were inadequately protected, and damage control mechanisms were insufficient. Japanese carriers could launch potent attacks but were fragile under fire. Strategic planning further highlighted the contrast. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Midway Plan relied on a complex sequence of coordinated strikes, diversions, and feints intended to confuse the Americans. Complexity, however, brings risk. Once U.S. codebreakers revealed Japanese intentions, the elaborate plan backfired. Forces were dispersed, battleships were too distant to support carriers, invasion units could not assist, and diversions weakened Japan's effective strength. In contrast, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz pursued a simpler approach. Stationing his carriers northeast of Midway, he waited for the Japanese to strike, then unleashed all available forces. Coordination was imperfect. Attack waves arrived separately, yet enough succeeded to sink Japanese carriers. Simple plans executed under less than ideal conditions proved superior to intricate designs requiring perfection. The Midway Battle reshaped naval warfare for decades. The U.S. produced 115 carriers during the war, while Japan managed only 25, a ratio that helped decide the Pacific conflict. The dive bomber pilots of June 4, 1942, were focused on their immediate tasks, surviving enemy fire, completing attacks, and returning safely. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, wounded and flying a plane riddled with bullets, worried about fuel. Lieutenant Richard Best, having shifted targets in mid-dive, evaded pursuing Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers, counted losses. Yet, in mere minutes, these aviators accomplished what years of conventional combat could not. They struck a decisive blow against Japanese naval strength, shifting momentum in favor of the Allies. Nimitz later reflected that without Midway, the war might have continued 3 more years, prolonging casualties and suffering. Japanese aviators aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiyu were highly trained, experienced, and dedicated. Having executed flawless operations at Pearl Harbor and elsewhere. On Midway, however, they were caught on the decks, unable to launch or defend effectively. Their skill could not compensate for the timing and precision of American attacks. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, though surviving with severe injuries, later documented the battle in his 1955 work, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, acknowledging American intelligence, the bravery of U.S. pilots, and effective leadership as decisive factors. Between 10:24 and 10:29 a.m., 3 Japanese carriers were critically damaged. All 3 sank within hours. Victory that enabled further success. These few minutes demonstrated that wars are shaped not by isolated battles, but by the systematic accumulation of strategic, industrial, and operational advantages. Victory in war is rarely determined by courage alone. It emerges from the cumulative impact of advantages, intelligence, industrial capacity, training, and technology. The side that compounds these advantages over time will almost inevitably prevail. In the Pacific War, Japan excelled in tactical skill and pilot training, but the United States held superiority in every other domain. A brief span of mere minutes made that imbalance starkly evident. From that moment onward, Japan was forced onto the defensive in a struggle it could not hope to win. The empire that had overrun half of Asia and the Pacific in half a year would spend the next 3 years losing every gain. American industrial power, virtually limitless resources, and the ability to replace ships, aircraft, and crews steadily wore down Japanese resistance, culminating only in the deployment of atomic bombs and Japan's surrender. The crucial minutes that ended Japan's hopes of victory marked the decisive turning point of the Pacific theater. Before 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan retained a slim opportunity to negotiate favorable terms. By 10:29 a.m., that opportunity had vanished. The remainder of the conflict merely unfolded along the path set by that decisive moment. The destruction of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu during those few minutes did more than determine the outcome of Midway. It shaped the fate of the entire war in the Pacific. Cryptographers who decoded Japanese communications, shipyard crews who returned Yorktown to service in just 3 days, torpedo squadrons drawing enemy fighters into traps, and destroyers positioned at just the right place and time. All contributed to a window of opportunity that altered history. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey later explained that he had no option but to continue his search. His mission was to locate and neutralize the Japanese carriers. He succeeded. His decisions, made under extreme pressure, with limited fuel and an empty sea, ended up influencing the fate of nations. At times, individual choices carry more weight than decades of planning. Minutes can outweigh years, and one pilot's directional decision can redirect the course of history. The Japanese carriers burned for hours before succumbing. Fires ignited at 10:24 a.m. spread uncontrollably, fueled by aviation gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes. Structural bulkheads failed, decks warped, and men trapped below either perished in the flames or drowned as compartments filled with water. The ships that had seemed invincible just months earlier were obliterated by the dawn of June 5, 1942. 5 minutes, 300 seconds, enough time to brew a coffee, cross a city block, or alter the course of history. At 10:24 a.m., Japan still had a chance. By 10:29 a.m., that chance was consumed by flames engulfing 3 carriers in the vast Pacific.